The clank of metal echoed through the camp, as if the very air trembled from tension. Under the scorching sun, when the stones beneath their feet already seared their souls, hundreds of warriors swung swords that weighed twice as much as real ones. Not for show, not for strength, for survival. Why did the Romans voluntarily turn training into torture? What compelled them to fight with weapons that could break an arm if you stumbled for even a moment? And what lay behind this strange cruelty, which they called discipline but felt as pain? The answer to this question lies in the very essence of the Roman war machine. The ancient historian Vegetius wrote that legionaries were taught to fight with swords twice as heavy as real ones, so that actual combat would seem easier to them than training. This principle became the cornerstone of the Roman army's preparation. Thus, endurance was formed, upon which the fate of the legion depended. These swords were called rudis, a training weapon made of wood, but with a weighted blade, so that the warrior's hand would get accustomed to extreme load. Imagine how it looked. A wooden sword, soaked with sweat, slipping in the palm, muscles burning, breath getting short, and the centurion giving no respite. Every strike was practiced hundreds of times, until the body began to move on its own, without thought, without doubt. They trained not for strength, but for automatism, so that in a real battle they would not think, only act. This training was not a romantic legend. Archaeological findings near Carthage and Mainz show remains of wooden training swords polished smooth by thousands of strikes. This means that what Vegetius described was not just a beautiful metaphor. This is the trace of their sweat caked onto the wood. The Romans called such an approach by the word disciplina, not just discipline, but a sacred duty. For a legionary, it meant more than life. To violate it meant to let down the entire formation, the entire army, the entire empire. The centurion ensured that every strike, every step, was performed with the same precision with which a blacksmith forges a sword. This system distinguished Rome from its enemies. Barbarians relied on fury and onslaught, but the Romans turned war into a craft. Their training resembled mechanical torture, where the body was broken to strengthen the spirit. The strongest in spirit survived, the weakest faded into the shadows, leaving no names. But it was precisely from such training that those were born who later withstood the onslaught of entire armies. And yet, in this machine-like strictness, one mystery was hidden. Why push training to the limits of human endurance if the enemy would still die from a simple blow? The answer lies not in the battle, but in the path that began long before it, even at the moment when a legionary first put on his armor. When a recruit first entered the legion's camp, he saw neither glory nor gold nor future triumphs. Before him was a ditch of mud, hues of tents, and the smell of sweat, iron, and smoked meat. Here his life began, and his former one ended. Before he was entrusted with the real sword, he had to prove that he was capable of enduring the harshest school of endurance in the ancient world. The first thing he received was not a weapon, but a shovel. And not because the Romans couldn't fight, but because every army lived in a camp that was rebuilt anew every day. This was a symbol of order. The camp had to be leveled to the inch, the ditch of a certain depth, the earthen wall of an exact height. Even lodging turned into training. Historians wrote that centurions checked that soldiers dug the ditch with the same diligence with which they would later breach the enemy's formation. Only after weeks of such preparation did the recruit receive a training sword, the heavy rudis, and a wicker shield, which they called escutum. This shield was almost 1.5 meters high and weighed up to 12 kilograms. But for training, centurions weighted it with stones, so that the soldiers' hands would know no rest. Under the sun of Italy, or under the downpours of Gaul, the legionaries struck at posts driven into the ground. These wooden targets were called pali. They symbolized the enemy. Strikes had to be delivered precisely, to the throat, to the face, to the groin, where one could kill fastest. Vegetius wrote that the daily norm consisted of no less than 2 hours of continuous weapon training, but many researchers believe that in practice, training lasted longer, as long as a soldier could hold a sword. The centurion did not count strikes, he counted mistakes. Every incorrect movement was punished publicly, by shame or by the lash. There was no place for pity in the camp, Rome built fighters, not men. It was then that the youth learned what the word centurio meant, a senior warrior responsible for 100 men. But in reality, a centurion was more than a commander. He was living discipline, embodied order. He ensured that steps coincided, strikes sounded in unison, breathing did not falter. He was an instrument of the very system in which a man turned into a part of a mechanism. To strengthen the body, legionaries were forced to march 25 kilometers in full armor. The kit weighed almost 40 kilograms, a bronze helmet, chainmail armor, lorica hamata, a gladius sword, a pilum spear, and food for 3 days. Modern military physiologists compare such loads to the training level of elite special forces units. But the difference is that the Romans did this daily, without medical support, without rest, without choice. These marches were called Iter Magnum, the Great March. In a day, they covered a distance that a modern person would consider torture, and yet, when they collapsed by the campfires in the evening, no one grumbled. Silence was part of the discipline. Only the sound of sharpening stones and rare commands broke the silence. Centurions patrolled the camp, checking that swords gleamed even at night. In archaeological layers beneath Glastonbury, more than a dozen fragments of weighted wooden swords have been found. They lay next to animal bones, testifying to camp life. This means that even far from Rome, legionaries did not cease their training. Every strike, every drop of sweat prepared them not only for battle, but also for obedience. And in this lay the great logic of the Roman army: training harder than battle. If you survived in the camp, you would survive on the field. But even this principle had its continuation. Because one day light strikes against wooden posts were replaced by real iron, and then a slight mistake caused not the lash, but blood. Thus began the next, most brutal stage, training in a real formation, where any step decided not only the fate of one person, but also the survival of the entire Roman line. At dawn, the air in the camp rang with metal. A dull thud of swords against shields, the rumble of footsteps could be heard, as if the earth trembled under the weight of Roman discipline. It was a day of formation drills, a moment when every legionary transformed into a part of a living war machine. If before he struck a wooden post, now others like him stood beside him, and any incorrect movement could break the formation. The centurion walked along the line, his gaze cold. The mistake of one, the death of all. These words were etched into the memory of everyone who held a sword. The Romans called such training exercitatio, the systematic practice of techniques as part of a unit. But this word meant more than exercise. It was a trial in which interdependence was forged. Every warrior had to know how to hold the line, how to raise his shield when the horn sounded, and how to march in a single rhythm, even when the ground beneath their feet was bloody. Polybius wrote that the Roman army triumphed not by numbers, but by its ability to move as one body. To achieve this, soldiers stood for hours in formation under the scorching sun. The centurion commanded, and the formation moved forward, then backward, then sideways, like a wave that does not break but bypasses obstacles. This skill cost lives. If one shield was held too low, an enemy spear would pass through the formation and a neighbor would die. Therefore, training was brought to automatism. Muscles had to remember everything themselves. One of the most famous formations was called testudo, the tortoise. When the legionaries raised their shields over their heads and interlocked them at the sides, they transformed into a bronze box, impenetrable to arrows. But to achieve a perfect tortoise, weeks of training were required. The shields had to interlock tightly, like scales, without gaps. Historians note that this formation saved the Romans under a hail of arrows in Gaul and Parthia, where enemies shot from above. One wrong step broke the entire formation, and then even experienced warriors perished. For such exercises there were special fields, Campus Martius, the field of Mars. Here the ground was strewn with sand, so that falls would not break bones. But they rarely fell. The centurion ensured that no one fell. To fall meant to weaken, and weakness had no right to exist in the Roman army. Archaeological findings near Cologne showed polished areas of ground with compacted sand, traces of training grounds. Scholars suggest that hundreds of warriors trained on them daily. A layer of ash testifies. Fires burned even at night, because training did not cease when the sun set. Legionaries practiced the trumpeter's signals, changes in formations, sudden attacks. The trumpeter, or kornicen, was the nerve of the army. His signals replaced words. 1 sound, reform. 2, attack. 3, retreat. The centurion merely watched to ensure commands were executed instantly. This silent precision amazed even enemies. The Greek historian Diodorus wrote that the Romans moved without shouts and chaos, as if they were not people but a mechanism. Such silence was more terrifying than any battle cry. It signified control. In this control lay the philosophy of Rome, victory through order. Where others rushed into a frenzy, the legionary raised his shield at an angle, covered his neighbor, and awaited a command. He knew that his life was part of the overall geometry of battle. To achieve this state, legionaries repeated maneuvers for hours. Polybius wrote that during exercises, soldiers performed all actions with weapons as if they were in a real battle. They threw spears, evaded imaginary blows, cut the air with a sword, feeling its weight, and again closed ranks. Every day, the same thing, to exhaustion. Only in this way did the Romans create their invincible force, not in a steel blade, but in the agreement of the hands, feet, and breath of hundreds of people. They did not just train, they learned to be part of a single heart that beats steadily and without fear. But all this was merely preparation. The real test began when they went into battle no longer against a post and no longer against a comrade, but against a living enemy, where everything they had been taught had to work in a single instant. It was there that the price of every sword strike, heavier than a real one, and every drop of sweat shed on the fields of Mars, was tested. When the sound of the trumpet echoed, time seemed to stop. In the camp, neither conversations nor laughter could be heard, only the creak of straps, heavy breathing, and the clang of armor. This was the signal for the start of combat training, proelium imitandum, the imitation of battle. Everything the legionaries had learned for months now combined into a single action, resembling real war. But here the enemies were their own, and precisely because of this, these trainings were more terrifying than a real battle. Plutarch wrote that the Romans considered preparation more important than the battle itself, because he who sheds sweat in training sheds less blood on the field. These words sounded not like a proverb, but like a law. Centurions arranged skirmishes between units where real shields and swords were used, but blunted. Such exercises were called armatura, combat practice in full armor. The weight of the swords and shields was even greater than in battle, so that muscles would get accustomed to the heaviness, and the psyche to fear. One of the terms the Romans prided themselves on was the gladius, a legionary's short sword about 60 centimeters long. Its shape seemed simple, but in the hands of a trained warrior it became lightning. The blow was delivered not from above, but from below, short, precise, to the stomach. Historians note that the Romans practiced this very technique for hours. Not wide swings like those of barbarians, but hidden, swift thrusts that killed instantly. When the legion formed up for training, the formation looked like a wall of metal. The first ranks held the scutum, large rectangular shields, interlocking them into a monolith. Behind them stood spearmen with the pilum, a heavy throwing spear. This formation resembled a living fortress. The centurion gave the command, the trumpeter gave the signal, and the warriors simultaneously threw their spears, then drew their swords and advanced. The precision of their movements was striking. Polybius wrote that it was not a battle but a spectacle of strength and order, where every mistake could cost a man his career or the respect of his comrades. To enhance the effect of fear, real elements of combat chaos were used in such training. Servants lit torches, creating smoke and heat. Drummers beat skins, imitating the roar of battle. Sometimes the centurion deliberately gave confusing commands, checking how quickly the legionaries could reform. Make a mistake, and your neighbor would push you away, because the formation had to remain intact. Every shield bash echoed throughout the entire formation, as if one huge chest was beating. Archaeological findings confirm the descriptions of ancient authors. Near the camp in Vindobona, modern Vienna, A field with numerous dents from spears and charred traces has been found, likely the site of similar training. This was not just preparation, it was the art of imitation. Legionaries had to get used to the smoke, to the shouts, to the smell of blood. Historians believe that injuries and sometimes even deaths were not uncommon during such exercises, but even blood in training was perceived as part of the Roman ideal, virtus, which meant not just courage but valor combined with self-control. To die during training was considered more honorable than to live as a coward on the battlefield. The philosopher Seneca wrote that a Roman learns from suffering as a blacksmith learns from fire. And indeed, training in the legion was a constant burning. First the body broke, then the will, then only one thing remained: habit. The habit of pain, of fatigue, of fear. Modern historians, such as Adrian Goldsworthy, note that precisely such a system made the Romans invincible. Their strength lay not in weapons, but in their mind subordinating the body. They did not fight, they performed tasks like a mechanism. Even in panic, they remained in formation. And yet, in this inhumane efficiency, a paradox was hidden. The more mechanical a legionary became, the less human he remained. He was taught not to feel, not to pity, not to hesitate. But it was precisely this absence of hesitation that made him Rome's main weapon. And when the time for real battle came, they no longer distinguished between training and war, because for them, both were part of one endless ritual of survival. When the legion set out on campaign, discipline did not end, it only became harder. Every day was like a continuation of the training nightmare, only now instead of wooden posts, real mountains, rivers and enemies lay before them. War began long before the clash with the adversary. It began on the march. Legionaries rose before dawn. They packed up camp, dismantled tents, unloaded equipment and marched forward 20 to 30 kilometers a day, carrying everything necessary for life and battle. Their nickname, Muli Mariani, Marius Mules, was born during Gaius Marius' reforms, when every soldier had to carry his own fate on his back. The weight of their packs reached 45 kilograms. Weapons, helmet, chainmail, personal belongings, a mess kit, food, tools, and a share of communal property. Soldiers marched in columns, 4 men abreast. Each step was measured by drum and trumpet. In front, scouts and standard bearers. Behind them, the centuries. Then, the baggage train with supplies. The Romans called such movement agmen ordinatum, meaning ordered column. Even on the move, their formation remained idea, as if the very earth submitted to the Roman rhythm. Polybius wrote that on average a legion covered 20 Roman miles a day, about 30 kilometers, and after that they did not rest. In the evening the legionaries built camp, a new one every day. Ditches, palisades, moats, towers, guard posts. According to Vegetius' regulations, no more than 2 hours were allotted for everything. The camp was sacred. If it was not built according to the rules, the duty centurion could be executed at dawn. Such a combination of physical and moral strain made the legionaries almost superhuman. Modern physiologists have calculated that the energy expenditure of a Roman warrior on campaign exceeded 4,500 kilocalories per day, the level of a marathon runner who runs daily. And yet, the warriors endured for weeks, for months. Their diet included grain, salt, vinegar, meat, a simple but nutritious mixture. According to archaeologists' testimonies, animal remains were found in some camps, confirming that meat was indeed part of the daily diet. But food was not the main source of strength. The main thing was disciplina, that sacred rule they revered. In the camp, one could not speak loudly, one could not leave weapons uncleaned, one could not argue with a commander. Violated, punishment was inevitable. At best, deprivation of rations. At worst, decimatio, decimation, when every 10th soldier was executed for the cowardice of the entire unit. This ancient ritual was more terrifying than any enemy. It kept the legion in obedience, not by fear of death, but by shame before comrades. Centurions, in turn, had no right to pity people. They were called spina legionis, the backbone of the legion. They received double rations, but also bore double the responsibility. If a common soldier fell from exhaustion, the centurion raised him with a blow from his vitis, a symbol of authority. This vine staff was more fearsome than a sword. A blow from it was considered a disgrace remembered for life. Modern archaeologists have found fragments of vine staffs and metal tips, confirming that the vitis was not a mere symbol, but a real weapon of discipline. Historians write that this very instrument created what we would today call morale. Sometimes during marches, centurions arranged short training sessions directly en route. During a halt, legionaries had to practice a maneuver, a formation, a spear throw. Not because they expected an attack, but because every day without training was considered a step towards defeat. Even during a campaign, the army remained a school where fatigue was the lesson and life was the exam. And yet, it was precisely these grueling marches, this eternal toil and monotony that made them invincible. When they reached the battlefield, enemies saw tired men, but they were mistaken. Before them stood machines for whom pain, heat and hunger were not enemies, but part of their service. And when finally the roar of drums announced the approach of real battle, the legionary understood. Everything he had endured was not punishment, but preparation, because ahead awaited the last and most terrible test, real battle, where the weight of the sword, with which he had lived for months, had to turn into the lightness of a blow that would determine the fate of the empire. Finally, the day for which the legion lived arrived. War was no longer a drill, and blood was no longer imaginary. Dust rose on the horizon, the sun blazed on bronze helmets, trumpets called to formation. Everything they had been taught now had to materialize in a single instant, when a man ceased to be a man and became part of a moving wall. The legion formed up in 3 lines. In front, the hastati, young fighters. Behind them, veterans called principes. In the rear, the most experienced, the triarii, the last reserve of the Roman army. This structure was called triplex acies, the triple order. Polybius described it as a living machine where each part knew its place. And when the trumpeter gave the signal to attack, thousands of feet moved in unison, as if the earth itself began to march. But the main secret was not in the formation, it was in the feeling of lightness. Now when the gladius sword weighed half as much as the training rudis, the hand flew like a dancer's. Every strike felt weightless, every block instantaneous. This was what they had suffered for months, to transform heaviness into lightness. The Romans believed that only one accustomed to suffering could wield true power. Caesar wrote that legionaries rarely made mistakes in battle. Even when they lost officers, they maintained formation. This was the miracle of the Roman machine. An army without a head continued to breathe. A centurion could die, but his century did not collapse. Every soldier knew what to do. They trained precisely for this, so that war would not catch them off guard. Plutarch recalled that during the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar's legionaries fought as if they were training, without superfluous movements, without panic, with the precision of a blacksmith striking sparks from metal. They were not heroes, they were artisans of death. But in this craft, there was grandeur. Every gladius strike was like a signature on the law of the empire, written in the blood of enemies. When the battle ended, the field was covered with smoke and silence. The vanquished groaned, the wounded asked for water, but the legionaries did not rush to help. They were ordered to clean the weapons, gather shields, count the dead. Even after victory, no rest, no triumph. Rome knew no pity, because pity destroys order. Modern historians call this phenomenon the Legionaries' psychological armor. It was forged not in battle, but in training. Months of pain, fear and fatigue were learned to transform into action without doubt. This was their superpower. What the enemy called cruelty, for them, was a way to survive. Archaeological findings near Numantia in Spain showed a Roman army camp with almost perfectly straight streets and traces of burnt campfires. Scholars note, even in combat conditions, the Romans maintained order as if on a parade ground. This was not just discipline, it was a way of thinking in which order is stronger than terror. When they returned to camp in the evening after victory, everything started anew. Cleaning armor, repairing straps, checking weapons. For them, there was no end of battle, there was only service. And somewhere between the clatter of sharpening stones and the crackle of campfires, the truth of Rome echoed. Strength is born in repetition. And here, the very loop from which everything began opens up. Why did they fight with swords heavier than real ones? Because the weight of the sword is the weight of destiny. Rome taught its warriors to endure the invisible, so they could conquer the visible. When they went into battle, their muscles already knew pain, and their minds silence. He who can remain silent under the burden of pain is already invincible. And now, having learned this, only one question remains. If you stood beside them, under the sun, with a 40-kilogram load on your shoulders and a sword that breaks an arm, would you endure even a day in the Roman formation? For the strength of these people was not in iron, but in the fact that they learned to be stronger than suffering itself. And, perhaps, this is precisely why Rome fell, not to its enemies, but because it ceased to teach its sons to hold a sword heavier than necessary.